So now that we've gone through some of the key operators in the Flux class, we're going to walk through a case study that will illustrate how to use these operators in practice. And this is going to be a two-parter because I don't want to have the video get too long. So part one of this case study, which is case study ex1, is going to show how to use Flux operators like fromIterable, just, fromArray, from, map, and so on and so forth to create, reduce, multiply, and display big fraction objects synchronously. So this first go around here is going to do synchronous stuff. The reason for that is we haven't talked about the concurrency operators and scheduling operators yet, but we will. That'll come next. So this particular example is found in the ex1 project in the reactive Flux folder in my live lessons GitHub repository. So here we are in the ex1 project in my live lessons GitHub repository for reactive fluxes. And let's first take a look at the main entry point. This is the main class, and you can see what we're going to do here is we're going to use the AsyncTaskBarrier to register a whole bunch of test functions. There's 5 of them, and these are all going to run synchronously. So there's no extra threads running around here, but just because we want to keep things consistent, we're going to use our AsyncTaskBarrier. So after we register all these test functions, we say, hey, AsyncTaskBarrier, please start running all the tests. Each of these things will run synchronously, and we will then call block, but it turns out that run tasks will just kind of block as each of those test methods is called. And by the time we're done, when block is called, it's already done with its processing, and then we print out how many tests completed successfully. So that's the test driver program. Let's go look at some of the methods here that are here in the Flux example or Flux EX class. So first thing you're going to see is we have 5 test methods. The first one's going to test big fraction multiplication using a synchronous Flux string. So the first thing we do is we make ourselves a string builder, which we're going to use to accumulate the results so they all get printed out in a nice clean way. And then we are going to create ourselves a Flux that will contain 4 big fractions with these various numerators and denominators. Notice we're not dividing by 0, so we shouldn't have problems with errors. We then use the doOnNext method to log each of these big fractions so we can see what their values were. We then use the map operator to take each of the big fractions and multiply them by some big reduced fraction, which you can see here is just a very large big fraction that has a very large numerator and a very large denominator. So that's what that is. And then we call subscribe, and subscribe will take each of the results from the multiplication and put them into the string builder that we defined up above as a mixed string. If there are any errors, which they're not, then we're going to go ahead and append the error message in the string builder and display the results. Otherwise, when the onCompletion event is received, we will display all the contents in that string builder. And we return something called s_void_m, which is just an empty mono, and that's just a way to indicate to the AsyncTaskBarrier this method is done. Okay, so that's one approach. You can see that we used just in order to be able to create that flux of big fractions. The next example, test fraction multiplication sync2, makes a string builder. And this time, it's going to make a list of big fractions. So before we used just, this time we're going to make a list of big fractions. It's actually the same values. And we're going to convert that list of big fractions into a flux by using the fromIterable factor method. Recall that that's one that works eagerly, so that will be done right there and then. We log the results like we did last time. We multiply them using the big reduced fraction. And just exactly like before, we are going to accumulate them using subscribe, putting everything that completes with the onNext event here into the string builder. And then if there's an error, which there won't be, we would append the error message. And then when we're all done and get the completion event, we print the results. And then tell the AsyncTaskBarrier, we're all done. The third and final method we're going to talk about, very similar to what we did before, but we're going to make a couple of little changes here for fun. As before, we have our string builder, but now we're going to make a random number generator. and we're going to make an array. So this time, instead of using a list or using just, we're going to have an array of big fractions. You can probably see where we're headed with this. We're going to use the fromArray factor method to turn that big fraction array into a flux. But now we're going to do some really fun stuff. We're going to take the flux that we're going to create another flux. So we have one flux, F1, which has got the contents of the array. And then we're going to make a second flux, F2. And what this is going to do is this is going to use the flux from method. It's a factory method that does dynamic assembly as opposed to eager assembly. And it's going to use the trick of calling the make big fraction factory method. And make big fraction is something we're going to see a lot, so I'll just cover it real quick. It basically takes in a random number generator and a Boolean flag to indicate whether what should be produced is reduced or not. And it makes an astronomically large, big, random integer, which is going to be the numerator. This is really, really, really big. And then it's going to make a denominator that's between 1 to 10. And then it's going to create a big fraction with that numerator and that denominator, and whether or not it's reduced or not. Now, in this particular case, as you'll see, we're going to reduce it. Other times when we do asynchronous processing, we will not. We'll do the reduction in a separate thread of control. And now we're going to take that result that comes from, which is basically bound to this dynamically callable, dynamic assembly-based factory method that will make a big fraction each time it's called randomly. And we're going to repeat that 3 more times. So we're going to end up with a total of 4 big fractions that are randomly generated. And then we're going to take the original list of big fractions, and we're going, or original flux of big fractions, and we're going to merge them with our newly created, randomly generated flux of big fractions. And then we're going to go through and multiply them and log them and use subscribe. So this part's all the same as we did before, where we're going to use map and subscribe and do on next and so on. But we're going to have a lot more. We're going to have 4 more big fractions that are generated randomly. So with that, let's go ahead and run this example, and we'll see what we get as the results. It's kind of fun just to see what you get. So here's what we got. The first example, the test fraction multiplication sync1, you can see we had an unreduced fraction, and then we reduced it to an improper fraction, and then we are going to go ahead and call to mixed string, and you can see what the results are from doing this. We're also going to multiply it by that other fraction. So you can see how we get all the results that are generated here in a mixed form, and that was the one that used just. Then down here we used the list version, same results, no surprise there, same output. But then for test fraction multiplication 3, we start out with the first 4 big fractions the same, because they're the ones we did before, except we just use an array. Except now we're going to generate these absolutely astronomically large big fractions using the random number make big fraction method. And you can see if you look at this, those big fractions go on for a very, very, very long time. They're really, really big. But they got created, they got reduced, and so on and so forth. And then we print those things out. So that's what we're going to show for case study ex1. So you now should have a good idea of how to use things like the different factory methods, just, fromArray, fromList, and from. We talked about how to use things like do on next, map, and subscribe. And we also showed how to use the repeat and merge with combining operators.